So I'm going to say a few words in a moment by way of introduction to the weekend. But just before I do that, I wanted to reflect very quickly on some of the events that have taken place since we last met. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, last week an MP, David Amos, was murdered. And like any murder, that was above all, of course, a terrible personal tragedy for him and for the people close to him. But as many people have said since then, in the week since then, the murder of an MP is also an attack on democracy. It's really important that any of us can access our MP, that we can express our problems, our concerns. That gets harder if security becomes tighter. And also, democracy is working best if any of us could become an MP, if any of us might be willing to put ourselves forward as candidates to be MPs. And of course, there are many reasons why we might not do that. But if we feel that we don't want to become MPs because of the abuse and the hatred that MPs are subject to, because of the real threats to their physical safety, then again, that's clearly a problem for our democracy. One of the other things that have struck me over the past week is just how many of David Amos's constituents, the people from the community that he represented, have talked about what a good MP he was, what a good person he was, how hard he was, how hard he worked on the problems facing his constituents. And, you know, we don't often hear people talking about MPs like that. And I think it's been a reminder that actually MPs are human beings, just like all of us. They're on the whole decent people. It's very easy to talk about how MPs are all just the same. They're all in it for themselves. They're all no-gooders. But actually, most MPs go into politics for good reasons, because they want to make the world a better place. They want to do good for their communities. And it's just really important, I think, to remember that. And it's also important, of course, I think all of us are infuriated sometimes by how MPs and politicians and people in public life talk and act and what they do. It can be incredibly frustrating. But it's worth just thinking about, well, why is it that people who, on the whole, go into politics for good reasons end up doing things that we do find so frustrating? Is it something about how our democratic system works? Is it something about our democratic culture? Is it just in part just necessarily the case that democracy is frustrating because none of us can ever get everything that we want? Compromise is essential. So I think these are really important questions for a citizens' assembly on democracy in the UK to reflect on, and you'll have a little chance in a moment to do so. But let me move on to introduce the plan for this weekend as a whole. Right, there we go. So hopefully you can see my slides. As Kayla said, we are kind of moving into a different phase of the Citizens' Assembly now. As you know, we've had weekend one when we talked about what does a good democracy look like. We explored kind of our initial ideas around that. Weekend two, we had an introduction to the democratic system in the UK, and we thought about what limits, if any, should be placed on what a democratically elected government can do. And that's kind of phase one of the Citizens' Assembly, if you like, developing some starting points for our thinking about these issues. Now, I'm sure you have thought just as much as I have that there's just been a huge range of different issues that have come up in our discussions, all sorts of different aspects of democracy we have talked about. And we couldn't possibly go into depth on all of those within the time that we've got together. So we have to focus in on certain issues. We have to do deep dives, as Kayla said just a moment ago. So we've got 3 weekends to do that. This weekend, we're focusing in on kind of the heart of power within the democratic system, if you like. What happens in government and parliament? And we sometimes treat that as a bit of a black box of the stuff that politicians do. But clearly, it's incredibly important what happens there. And it's important for us to get beneath the bonnet and think about just what are the relationships between the different parts of the core of the political system. So that's this weekend. Then next weekend, we'll be talking about the roles of the public. So in a lot of the conversations that you've been having and the things that you've been talking about, you've been expressing your interest in, well, what can members of the public do? What's it possible? And through what routes is it possible for people to have an impact upon outcomes in our democratic system? And there are also questions about whether members of the public have responsibilities in our democracy to do certain things, to behave in certain ways, and so on. So we'll be talking about those roles of the public in weekend 4. And then also in a lot of the discussions that you've had, many of you have expressed your concern about rights, ensuring that people's rights are protected. Some of you have also been concerned that maybe that talk about rights sometimes goes a bit too far. Many of you have been concerned about the standards of behavior among policymakers, and how can we ensure that policymakers are honest and are not behaving in corrupt ways, for example. So those are the sorts of things that we'll be focusing on in weekend 5. And then the final phase of the assembly will be in weekend 6, when we draw out conclusions. We draw all these various strands together, and we come to overall conclusions. So let me say just a bit more then about weekend 3 and what we're focusing on here. So we've got government and we've got parliament. The pictures there are about the current government and current parliament, but it's really important to remember that we're interested in understanding the democratic system as a whole. So important to be thinking about governments in general, parliaments in general, not just the current ones. So we're not just thinking about whether we happen to like or not like the current government. We're trying to think about how the system as a whole might work. And indeed, those pictures there are about the UK government and UK Parliament, but those of you in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland might also be interested in the relationship between the Scottish government and Parliament, between the Welsh government and the Senate, or between the Northern Ireland executive and the Assembly. So in all of these systems, all of these bits of the UK system, Parliament and government are very closely linked. So Parliament chooses the government comes from Parliament. The government can exist only so long as it has the support, the confidence of Parliament. But government and Parliament are also very, very different kinds of things. So parliaments have lots of members. A parliament represents the whole country, so that they're MPs from every part of the country, whereas the government doesn't necessarily have MPs from every part of the country. The government contains a very wide range of views, people from all different political parties, whereas the government just has one party in the UK case, or two parties in the Scottish government, for example, not the full range of views. A parliament also is able to work out in the open. We can watch the debates of parliament, whereas we've got a picture of the cabinet meeting there, but we can't see a cabinet meeting actually in operation. So if we're interested in transparency within our democracy, one of the principles that you've talked about over the last few weekends, or if we think that it's important for policy making to take into account all those various different perspectives, then probably we're going to think that Parliament has a really important role to play. On the other hand, government has very important strengths as well. So a government will have a particular agenda based on a manifesto that people have voted on in elections. Government is able to provide leadership in order to kind of drive through that agenda and push it forward. A government can also act quickly in circumstances of emergency, whereas a parliament with all of those different views, all of those different people, would find it much, much harder to act quickly. So if we think that it is important for a government to be able to act, to get on with things, to deliver a manifesto that people have voted on, then government is going to have to play an important role. If we think that acting in a crisis is important, then again, government is going to have an important role. So thinking about the balance of power between government and parliament, it may be something that some of you have never thought about before. It may be something that feels quite a little bit abstract, perhaps, to some of you. But actually, it's crucial for a lot of the principles that you have been talking about over the last 2 weekends, that we get into thinking about this relationship between government and parliament. And it's also a relationship that is in practice really important. So it affects our lives very directly. So if we just think of the last few years with coronavirus and all the huge changes that governments have imposed on our lives, as a result of measures to tackle the coronavirus. So on the one hand, we might think, well, actually, it's been essential that governments have been able to act quickly and decisively and make rapid and big changes. So government power has been very important. On the other hand, we might be concerned that some of those changes have been made without terribly much scrutiny, without much public debate, without perhaps taking into account all the different range of views. So perhaps we think that actually, particularly in times of crisis, Parliament's role is crucial. So these are big questions. They relate to the principles that we've been talking about already, and they also relate very practically to our day-to-day lives. So that's what I'll say by way of introduction, and I shall hand back to Kayla.